All right, Sarah, I think I'll hand it over to you and we will get started.
All right, sounds good. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about the Mediterranean diet. So just before we flip over to the PowerPoint presentation, I just wanted to introduce myself, say hi. I am Sarah. I'm one of the dietitians at the Family Health Team. I'm going to be presenting today's workshop. And I just wanted you to be able to put a face to my name before we switch it over. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to let Cheryl flip it over to the PowerPoint presentation so that you can see the slides.
All right. Here. All right, how is that, Sarah? Are you seeing that?
Yep, I can see that.
Okay.
Perfect.
Whenever you're ready, let me know and I will go to the next slide.
All right, so like I said, and like you're all aware, today we're going to talk about the Mediterranean diet, which is a delicious and satisfying way to eat. I'm Sarah, I'm the dietitian from the Family Health Team, and we are going to get started now. We can head on to the next slide. All right, so just before we get into it, I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping today. So Cheryl had introduced herself. She is our program support assistant, and she's going to help me run the PowerPoint presentation. The presentation will probably be 45 minutes to an hour in length. There will be a couple points where I'll ask you a few questions or ask you to raise your hand on the computer. So to do that, there's 3 dots in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and you should have an option to raise your hand. If you don't have that option, which I don't on my own computer, if you don't have the option, don't worry about it. But if you do, then just raise your hand when I ask you to. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, you can also type those into the Q&A. Also, through the 3 dots on your lower right-hand corner of your screen. And we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation as well. Right now, everyone is auto-muted just to help limit any background noise throughout the presentation. And I also just want to let everyone know that we are recording this presentation. You're all here anonymously. But if we do unmute you, if you have a question, your voice is going to be recorded. So just so that you're aware of that. We are going to make this presentation available later on our website if you do want to ever go back and have a look at something afterwards. If you have any questions or you want any more information after the presentation, you can send us an email at info@nfht.ca or give us a call at 289-252-2139. As well, if you are a patient of the Family Health Team and after the presentation you do want to chat again in more depth about this, our nutrition program is a self-referral, so you can always give our office a call and set up an appointment with myself or Melissa, who is our other dietitian at the Family Health Team. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to talk about what is the Mediterranean diet or the Mediterranean lifestyle? And what does that look like in terms of eating? Then we'll talk a little bit about the why behind the research. So why should we follow the Mediterranean diet? And then we'll get into how can we make these changes. All right, next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to ask everyone to raise your hand if you're able to, if you've ever been on a diet in the past. All right, so I see a few hands being raised, which is okay, I can see that. All right, so if you've tried any fad diet in the past, that could be anything like the cabbage soup diet, the South Beach diet. The newer ones are more the keto diet or intermittent fasting. We know that these aren't sustainable, right? And that's where we get that term yo-yo dieting. We often do something so extreme or so restrictive in order to, you know, see the weight come off, but it's not something that we can keep up with forever, right? So then when we come off of that diet, we often see the weight come back, and sometimes we gain even more weight than when we started, right? So the Mediterranean diet has the word diet in it, but it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle. So it's a way of eating that we want to do for the rest of our lives, and that can help benefit our health as well, right? So we're going to go over what that includes, you know, how we can follow it, and how we can follow it while including all foods into our diet and our lifestyle. All right, next slide. Okay, so the Mediterranean diet is based off of the traditional foods that are from the countries that surround the Mediterranean Sea, right? So we might be thinking, oh, well, we don't live by the Mediterranean Sea, so how can we possibly eat like they do? But all the foods that we're going to talk about can be found in any of our local supermarkets. Next slide. Okay, so this is a map of the Mediterranean Sea. We can see, you know, there's lots of different countries that surround the Mediterranean Sea. Let's do another raise your hand if you've ever been to any of these countries and if you enjoyed the food while you were there. Perfect. All right. Some hands are being raised. You know, I've been to one of them, and a lot of these countries are on my bucket list, just so that I can go out and try the food and learn how to recreate it. All right, next slide. Okay, so if we take a look at this picture, what is something that stands out to us, right? So what's the first thing we notice when we're looking at this picture? So take a minute, have a look at the picture, think about what stands out to you. Right, so I would think, you know, the first thing to me that comes to mind is that it's very colorful, right? There's a lot of different colors, a lot of bright colors. You know, we see the rainbow, and you've probably heard the term before, you know, eat the rainbow, not in terms of the Skittles, but in terms of different foods, right? So these different colors are going to help us give our body the different nutrients that it needs, right? So we can see red, we see orange, lots of green, there's purple, there's yellow, lots of different colors on there. One thing that a lot of people also notice is that there's a bottle of wine, right? So wine can be included in the Mediterranean diet, and we will get into that later on. But the one thing to kind of take from this picture is the colors. Remember, we want our plate to be nice and colorful. All right, next slide. Okay, so we're going to go over 8 simple steps for good health, and these are 8 steps that will help us better follow the Mediterranean diet. So there's 8 kind of main principles that make up the Mediterranean diet. So step 1 is eat lots of vegetables, right? And this is probably something that we've all heard before. You know, we've probably been told our whole lives, you know, make sure we eat our vegetables, right? And this is a big part of the Mediterranean diet, is making sure we're getting plenty of vegetables. So you might think, well, what is plenty? What is a lot, right? How do we know how much we should have? So one way I like to think about it is, if we think about what our plate looks like at our meals, you know, can we try and get half a plate of vegetables? You know, mainly at lunch and dinner, right? So this is ideally what we'd like to aim for. And for some people, that might seem like a lot. We're not quite there yet, and that's okay. We want to slowly work our way up to that half a plate, right? So, you know, maybe we don't have any vegetables at our meal, and that's okay. One of our goals might be to, you know, include a little bit, right? So even, you know, maybe we're at a quarter of a plate right now, and we slowly want to kind of work our way up to that half a plate, right? So the main thing is we want to take small steps to get to our end goal of that half a plate, right? And if we do it this way, then we're more likely to be able to stick with it, right? Rather than going from, you know, no vegetables to half a plate. So step 1, again, eat lots of vegetables. Next slide. Okay. So kind of thinking back to that first picture we saw, again, thinking of what colors are we eating? So take a minute and kind of think back. Maybe it was your lunch that we just had. Maybe you think back of yesterday. You know, what did your plate look like? right? Was it colorful? Were there lots of different vegetables on there? Or maybe everything was the same color, right? So remember, we want to try and get a colorful plate. And the more colors mean we're getting all the different nutrients that the different colors have to offer, right? So what we want to try and aim for is that picture on the left of lots of colors, and that's going to help us better follow the Mediterranean diet. All right, next slide. So step number 2 is changing the way we think about meat. So we often think of meat as the main part of our meal, and that often means that we're getting larger portions than we really need. So one thing we want to try and do is think of meat as more of a garnish for flavor rather than the main focus of our meal. So again, if we think about our plate and what that looks like, ideally what we want to aim for is about a quarter of our plate to be our meat. Or our protein. So if we think about what that looks like, take a look at the palm of your hand, or if we think about like the size of a deck of cards would be 1 serving of meat, right? So if we think about, the size of a steak or even a chicken breast these days, they're much larger than that. So a lot of us are having more meat than we need, and our plate is more than a quarter would be our meat. And what that means is just that we have less room on our plate for our vegetables. Right? So one thing we want to try and do is cut back on the portions of our meat, trying to keep it to about a quarter of our plate. And what that does is it helps give us that room to aim for that half a plate of vegetables at our meals, right? So ideally what we'd like to see is more vegetables and less meat on our plate. All right, next slide. Okay, so step number 3 is enjoying some dairy products. Right? So dairy is included in the Mediterranean diet in moderation. This includes things like milk, cheese, and yogurt. And these are all great sources of calcium and vitamin D and protein as well. Right? So choosing a Greek yogurt or regular yogurt, again, will help give us that protein, including small amounts of cheese will help give us protein. When we say dairy and with the cheese, one thing we want to kind of keep in mind is we want to try and choose those processed cheeses a little less often, focusing more on, the hard cheese. And one thing we can try is, a plain Greek yogurt and adding our own flavor to it by adding, fresh fruit or frozen fruit to it to help sweeten it up. Right? So we want to enjoy dairy products in moderation. All right, next slide. Okay, so step number 4 is eating seafood twice a week. So seafood is a big part of the Mediterranean diet. Fish and seafood are great sources of lean protein, which means that they're lower in saturated fat. Right? So our goal is to have fish or seafood twice a week if we can. So again, if we kind of think back maybe to the past week or the past month, think back on how often are you having fish or seafood, right? If it's not at all, maybe we try and add it in once in a while, right? If we're already having it once a week, can we try and make that twice a week, right? And it can be whatever kind of fish, whatever kind of seafood that you enjoy eating, right? And that's going to fall under, again, that quarter of our plate would be our protein, which would be our fish or our seafood, right? And another great reason to eat fish or seafood more often is that it's great for our brain health and our heart health. So again, we want to try and aim for a variety of fish and seafood options, depending on what we like or do not like. Okay, next slide.
Oops. There you go.
All right, so step number 5 is cooking a vegetarian meal once a week. So again, we often think of meat as the main part of our meal, but we want to try and get away from that sometimes and try going meatless, right? So you might have heard the term meatless Mondays. Maybe we try and make that our new tradition, right? And that's our once a week where we have a meatless meal. And sometimes this can seem really scary, right? Once a week might feel like a lot. So again, right, think back to, are we doing this at all? And if we aren't, maybe we try it once and we see how that goes, right? If we're doing it once a month, maybe we can start trying for twice a month, right? The main thing we want is to try and cut back on our meat intake, which doesn't mean that we need to cut it out, right? But by choosing vegetarian proteins more often, using a vegetarian meal, it's a good way to help us cut back on our meat intake. So when I say vegetarian proteins, it could be using lentils or beans in place of ground meat. Maybe we enjoy tofu, or maybe one of our goals is to try tofu. It's whatever we are comfortable with, right? So vegetarian proteins include beans and legumes, nuts and seeds, eggs and dairy can be vegetarian proteins as well. And, again, right, if we don't really know where to start, an online search for vegetarian meals will give you lots of options, right? So just thinking of, again, what are some meals that we can make that maybe we can try and make vegetarian, right? So again, right, if something calls for ground beef, lentils are a great swap for that, right? Or thinking of what do we like that's vegetarian and how can we maybe base a meal around that, right? So aiming for once a week. Once we get comfortable doing once a week, maybe we try 2, right? All right, next slide. Okay, so step number 6 is an important one, and that's using good fats. So what do I mean when I say good fats? So with good fats, we're talking about unsaturated fats. So what are unsaturated fats? These are things like olive oil, olives, avocados, nuts, seeds, and fatty fish. So the fatty fish would be things like salmon, mackerel, sardines, tuna. Another thing to think about is how are we preparing our meals? When we're cooking, are we cooking with butter or are we cooking with oil? If we're using oil, is it an olive oil, right? So we want to try and use olive oil as our main source of added fat. We can use it in cooking, we can use it as a dressing. It's a great source of unsaturated fat. Some people are a little nervous about cooking with olive oil. So if we think about that, an extra virgin olive oil is a better option for no heat. So something like a dressing. And regular olive oil is going to be better in cooking and in high heat, right? Another thing, to help us get some good fats in could be trying to snack more often on things like nuts and seeds instead of more processed snacks that might be higher in saturated fat. So making that swap also can help us get more of those good unsaturated fats that we want. Okay, next slide. Okay, so number 7 is making the switch to whole grains. So this means that, as often as we can, we want to try and choose whole grain products, right? So what is a whole grain product? So if we're choosing a bread or a cracker, what we want to look for is for that very first ingredient to say whole grain. And that's going to tell us that it is using the whole grain. Other whole grain sources are things like brown rice or wild rice over a white rice, using a whole wheat pasta over a white pasta. Other grains are quinoa, bulgur, barley, oats. Those are all of our whole grains. So why should we be choosing whole grains? So when we choose whole grains, what that's telling us is that we're getting all of the benefits that the grain has to offer. So that means that it's giving us all the parts of the grain, which means it's giving us some protein, it's giving us some fiber, and it's giving us all the good nutrients that our body needs that the grain has. So if we think about that compared to, if we're choosing a white bread or white rice or white pasta, what's happening there is they're taking away the 2 parts of the grain And those two parts of the grain are the parts that are giving us a lot of the good stuff, the protein, the fiber, the little bit of good fats, the vitamins and minerals have all been taken out from that. So they will often add some of the vitamins and minerals back in, but then we're still missing the protein and the fiber from the grain. So those parts are important because the protein and the fiber are also what help to keep us fuller for longer, so that a little bit can go a long way, right? So we do want to try and choose whole grain options as much as possible. And then again, if we think back to, what does that look like on our plate? That's going to be that final quarter of our plate. So we want to aim for about a quarter of our plate of whole grains at our meals whenever possible. And that's going to help complete our balanced meal, right? So we've got our quarter plate of our whole grains, quarter plate of our proteins, and then that half a plate of our vegetables. So that gives us our full plate. And following this most of the time is going to help make sure we get that balance and variety at meals, while helping us ensure that we're giving our body all of the nutrients it needs by choosing that balanced meal. All right, next slide. Okay, so the last step is choosing fruit more often, especially when it comes to desserts. So fruit is something that maybe we can all eat a little bit more of, and it gives us that something sweet without all the added sugar of a traditional dessert. So it doesn't mean that we can't ever have desserts or treats, but we really do want to try and save those for special occasions as a way to treat ourselves. Some people need to finish off their meal with something sweet, right? And that's where we want to try as much as possible to have that sweet ending be a piece of fruit, right? You might have heard, some people say, oh, you shouldn't eat fruit because it has sugar in it. But fruit is giving us so much more, right? Fruit has the natural sugar, but it's giving us tons of fiber and a lot of vitamins and minerals that are great for our health as well. So we definitely want to try and include more fruit in our diets, right? So same thing as what was mentioned with vegetables, we want to see those different colors in our fruits. So remember that the different colored fruits are going to be giving us different nutrients. So aiming for as much variety as possible when choosing our fruits. Next slide. Okay, so again, kind of thinking back to everything that we've said, kind of that bigger message is aiming for, we want a balance and variety of food, but we want to put a little bit more focus on those whole foods that we talked about. So lots of fruits and vegetables, the whole grains, lean proteins, and our dairy. So thinking more of, how can we maybe get more of those foods into our diet? Processed foods and processed meats have, they've become much more common because of the convenience factor, right? They're ready to eat, they're ready to go. Often very little or no preparation time. But these are things that we want to try and choose less often, right? So again, we can look at those pictures, and again, looking at the colors, we see all the different colors in the fresh produce, whereas the processed meats are all kind of that one color, right? Okay, next slide. Okay, so we've talked about, what can we do in terms of our diet to help us better follow the Mediterranean diet? But it's more than just diet. So again, it's that lifestyle piece. So part of that is including activity, right? So we want to be including physical activity as part of our regular routine. And, it's looking for ways to be active. So activity can be anything that gets us up and moving, right? And it doesn't have to be, going to the gym or going on the treadmill if that's not something that we're going to enjoy. So we do want to also find the joy in movement, right? If we're doing something just because we think that we should be, chances are we're not going to be doing it for too long, right? So think about what types of movement you enjoy doing, right? So this slide mentions dancing, walking, swimming, biking, it could be gardening, it could be hiking, whatever we enjoy that can get us up and moving is what we want to include, right? So again, right, don't do any form of activity just because you think you should be. Trying to find ways that you can be active and enjoy it as well is going to make it much more sustainable. Okay, next slide. All right, so again, we talked about, it's more than just what we're eating. So another big part of the Mediterranean diet is how we're eating. So one of the things that's part of the Mediterranean diet or Mediterranean lifestyle is, we want to enjoy food with others. And what that is talking about is basically, we want to be able to sit down at our meals and focus on what we're eating, right? So that means getting away from eating in front of the TV, or maybe we're eating at our desk. We want to get away from that distracted eating. So when we eat with distractions, what's happening is we're not really connecting with what we're eating, which also means that it's likely not going to be satisfying and might leave us wanting even more, even if the amount of food that we have is enough. When we sit down at a meal with no distractions, what that does is it helps us really appreciate our meal, and it allows it to be that much more satisfying, right? So when we're eating, if we can sit down, turn the TV off, put our phones away, and really just thinking about our meal. So how does your food taste? What is the texture of our food, right? Giving yourself the time to really slow down, chew your food well. And what this also does is it helps us to better recognize when we start to feel full. When we start to feel full, that's our body telling us, we've had enough to eat, we've given it all that it needs. So when we eat with distractions, we also often don't feel our fullness until it's too late and we've already overeaten, right? So thinking about that, maybe a goal that we set or a way to, something to start with is trying to get away from that distracted eating and really setting aside that time for our meals and our snacks so that we can really appreciate our food and have it, truly satisfy us. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the Mediterranean diet pyramid, which some of you may have seen before. It's like the food guide that they use in the Mediterranean. So what it's showing us is all of the things that we've talked about so far, right? So we'll see on the bottom, these are things that we want to do, that aren't directly diet related. We want to enjoy physical activity, and we also want to enjoy our meals with others, right? So that's kind of, again, part of that lifestyle piece. The bottom of the pyramid as well, you'll notice, that's where all the colorful foods are, right? You'll see our vegetables, our fruits, the whole grains. You might notice there's nuts and seeds and beans and legumes down there. And you'll notice there's a bottle of olive oil as well. So these are the things that we want to try and base our meals around, including them, at every meal, if that's possible, right? On top of that, what we see is the fish and the seafood. And again, we talked about choosing those, twice a week if we can. And those are going to be, again, our leaner protein sources. On top of that, we'll see our poultry, our eggs, our cheese, and our yogurt to be included in moderation. So it mentions, maybe we have a little bit each day. Maybe we're having them, a few times a week, right? At the very top of the pyramid, what we'll see is our red meats and our sweets. So we mentioned, these are recommended to have less often. Again, it doesn't mean that we can't ever have them. We want to be able to enjoy them, and we really want to be saving them as a way to treat ourselves, right? So we want these to be less often. We don't really want these foods to be our everyday foods. So again, we'll notice I mentioned the wine before. So wine in moderation can be part of a healthy lifestyle, right? So moderation is 1 drink a day for women and 2 drinks a day for men. But if we don't drink wine, we don't have to start, right? We don't need to include it just because it's there, but if we are drinking wine, knowing in moderation, it's part of a healthy lifestyle. So the last thing that we'll notice on here is it says to drink water, right? So this is what we want to be choosing for our main beverage throughout the day. And what that does is it also takes us away from choosing more of those sugar sweetened beverages, right? So water is a sugar-free option that can quench our thirst and that can be used for so many different ways in our body. So we do want to try and have water as our main drink option. All right, next slide. Okay, so we'll get into each part of the pyramid in a little more detail. So again, vegetables, we want to try and get in lots of vegetable choices, getting as much variety as we can with our vegetables. And with our vegetables, it's however we like to eat them. If we want to get some fresh vegetables, some frozen vegetables, canned vegetables, if we prefer them raw or if we prefer them cooked, all vegetables are great. Some tips can be, buying fresh veggies when they're in season is when they're cheaper, and we can always kind of stock up and freeze them ourselves. Frozen vegetables are also a great option. There's less preparation, less waste because we can just take out what we need and use that and put the rest away for another time. People often think badly of canned vegetables, but canned vegetables are another great option. One thing to look for is a no salt added canned vegetable. And then if we are having canned vegetables, just making sure that we're giving them a good rinse before we're eating them. But again, with our vegetables, it's thinking, what vegetables do I like and how can I get those in more often, right? Next slide. Okay, so we talked about whole grains a little bit, right? We want to try and choose whole grains whenever possible because there's so many more benefits when we have the whole grain. We're getting all of the good stuff that the grain has to offer. So we did go through what the whole grains are. There's some listed down here, right? So choosing a whole grain bread or pita bread, oats, bulgur, couscous, choosing a whole wheat or a whole grain pasta, polenta, a brown rice, black rice, wild rice, farro, spelt, and other grain options. So again, thinking, maybe what grains are we having? Are we having whole grains or do we need to maybe try and make that switch? Or if we're having whole grains already, maybe some of these things on the list we've never tried, and maybe we want to experiment a little bit and try some new grains. All right, next slide. Okay, so we talked about how great olive oil is because it's a great source of unsaturated fats, right? And it's kind of one of the main things in the Mediterranean diet is using olive oil as your main added fat, right? So trying to use that as often as we can. But there are also, as we mentioned, other sources of healthy fats, other sources of unsaturated fats, things like avocados, olives, nuts, fish, seeds are all also great sources of unsaturated fats. If we want to switch it up from olive oil once in a while, there are other oil options, something like a canola oil or any kind of nut or seed oil as well will give us the benefits of those healthy fats. Next slide. Okay, so beans, seeds, and nuts. We did talk a little bit about meatless meals and vegetarian protein. So choosing these are going to be our vegetarian sources of protein or some of our vegetarian sources of protein. Whatever kind of nuts and seeds that we like. Maybe we choose those as a snack or we could sprinkle them on our salad or with our cereal or our yogurts. There's lots of different foods that we can add those to or we can eat them on their own. If we are having nuts, we do want to try and choose an unsalted nut or seed. Beans and legumes, again, great source of protein, and these are going to be giving us lots of fiber as well. So things like chickpeas, black beans, kidney beans, pinto beans, again, whatever kind of beans we like. Canned beans or dried beans are fine. It's again, whatever you prefer. If we are buying canned beans, again, just making sure that we give them a good rinse before eating them. All right, next slide. Okay, so fruits, same as vegetables, we want to try and get lots of variety, lots of different colors. And same thing, we can choose fresh fruit, we can try frozen fruit or canned fruit or dried fruit. If we are looking at a canned fruit, trying to choose fruit that's packed in water rather than a juice or a syrup, since the fruit is sweet enough on its own. Again, with fruits, we sometimes think fruit juice kind of counts, but we want to try and get away from juice or just trying to, again, cut back on the juice. And we want to try and eat the fruit rather than drink it. So what that's going to do is it's going to help us get all the benefits of the fruit, which means we're getting all the fiber the fruit has to offer, all the vitamins and minerals the fruit has to offer with, the amount of sugar that's in that one fruit, right? And if we think about, a glass of juice, think about how many fruits it's taking to make that. And it's taking a lot of the sugar and we're not getting the fiber from the fruit. If we really like fruit juice, one option could be to just think of how often are we having it, and maybe we can cut back on that. Or another option is if we are having fruit, maybe we try and dilute it with some water so that it's less sweet, which will help us still get the flavor of the juice and less of the sugar from it, right? So again, trying to get in more fruit, and again, aiming for lots of variety within our fruits. Next slide. All right, so we talked about choosing fish and seafood more often, right? Aiming for twice a week. So again, it's whatever kind of fish or seafood we enjoy. It could be your fatty fishes like our salmon, our tuna, our sardines. But other fish and seafood, there's lots listed on here. Those are great options as well, right? They're all lean protein sources. And again, they're good for our heart, good for our brain health. So trying to get in fish and seafood more often. Next slide. All right, so we talked about enjoying dairy. Again, it could be yogurt, it could be cheese, it could be milk. Dairy is great for our gut health. It gives us calcium and vitamin D that will help with our bones. So a few things to remember, with dairy, like in a yogurt or something like a chocolate milk, flavor is often equals sugar, right? So, if you like the plain yogurt, again, enjoying that, or the flavored yogurt, enjoying that in moderation. If we want to try a plain yogurt, and sweeten it up with maybe some fruit, and that will help us enjoy it a little better, right? When we talk about milk to drink, we want to aim for something that's 2% or less. We talk about the low fat milk would be 2% or less. And then again, with cheese, like was mentioned before, choosing whatever cheese we enjoy, trying to just watch our intake of processed cheeses, right? All right, next slide. Okay, so eggs and poultry are great sources of lean protein as well. Eggs are great and they give us lots of vitamins and minerals, and they can be enjoyed at any meal, right? So people often think that eggs are only for breakfast, but if we like eggs, then we can have them at lunch and dinner as well, right? It's what works for us. Maybe in the morning we prefer to have something else, but maybe lunch or dinner one day is going to be eggs, and that's fine because that's going to be that protein part of our plate. With our poultry, again, leaner protein, trying to choose a skinless, boneless poultry can help us cut back on the saturated fat. But again, eggs and poultry, again, enjoying in moderation, they're great sources of protein. Okay, next slide. Okay, so our once in a while foods we talked about are our sweets and our red meats. So again, it doesn't mean that we can't ever have these foods, but they are foods that we want to have once in a while, right? We really want to save them as a way to treat ourselves, right? So for our sweets, if we can save these for special occasions and enjoying fruit more often as that's something sweet. That's what we want to try. And, red meat is a great source of protein. It's still giving us lots of good stuff, but it is higher in saturated fat. So it might be thinking back, how often am I having red meat? And maybe I can try and cut that back, right? And when we are having it, watching our portion sizes, right? So we mentioned we want to try and keep our portion sizes of our meat to something that's about the size of the palm of our hand or a deck of cards. Or if we think about what our plate looks like, that's going to be about a quarter of our plate. All right, next slide. Okay, so talking about water again, we do want this to be our kind of go-to drink throughout the day. Knowing we will also get water, through our diet, fruits and vegetables are going to give us lots of water as well. If we are drinking tea or coffee, those can be good choices as well. We say in moderation, but also being aware of, are we adding anything to that? Are we adding a lot of sugar? Are we adding a lot of cream? And if we are, then just keeping those drinks in moderation, right? Some people aren't huge fans of water. One thing that we can try is adding our own flavor, our own natural flavor. So maybe we add some fruit or some mint or like cucumber to our water to help add some flavor. Or if you're a fan of carbonated beverages, something that's naturally flavored is another great way to stay hydrated, right? But we do want to try and choose water as our main beverage throughout the day. All right, next slide. Okay, so back to wine again, right? There are studies that show that there are health benefits to drinking wine in moderation, right? So again, moderation is 1 glass a day for women and up to 2 glasses a day for men. If we don't drink wine, we don't have to start. And there's also some benefits, again, with grape juice. If people don't drink wine, but again, with the juice, if we can try and drink a little bit or dilute it or choose water more often. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we talked about what is the Mediterranean diet, what foods, what does it include in terms of kind of that Mediterranean diet lifestyle. So there's also, why should we follow the Mediterranean diet? So there is a lot of scientific evidence that shows that following the Mediterranean diet or Mediterranean lifestyle has many health benefits. So it can help lower our risk of heart disease and high blood pressure. It can help fight certain cancers and chronic diseases. It can help with asthma. It can help prevent or help manage diabetes and manage our blood sugars. It can help with our mental health, and it can help nurture healthy babies. So for all of these reasons, we're encouraged to follow that Mediterranean lifestyle. Okay, next. Okay, so thinking of, again, the foods that we talked about, what are some ways that we can maybe swap a few things, that we're currently having to help us better follow that Mediterranean diet or that Mediterranean lifestyle, right? So, if we like sandwiches, what are we putting on our sandwiches? If we're used to putting mayonnaise on our sandwich, one thing we can try is swapping the mayonnaise to hummus, or even, using avocado instead, because both of those things are still going to have that creaminess, and they're going to have some of those good fats that we want, right? The other thing, if we put butter on our toast, maybe sometimes we swap it for olive oil or using a nut butter instead. I have heard from people who tried to put olive oil on their toast and they said it wasn't so great. It made it soggy, right? So maybe we don't try that, but maybe we try a nut butter. If we really love butter, we want to have that in moderation, right? So just a thin layer on our toast so that we can get the flavor of the butter, or maybe we try again, every once in a while we swap that butter with a nut butter to give us some of the good fats and a little bit of fiber from the nuts. If we are used to making a pasta sauce with meat, maybe we try adding more vegetables. Or, another option could be swapping the meat for beans, right? Or maybe we do half meat, half beans, and still trying to get in lots of veggies in there. If we are someone who likes our sweets, we like to have cake, chocolate cake. Again, right, ending that meal with fruit is what we want to try. So maybe we try something like a baked pear, with a yogurt sauce, or even baked apple with a little bit of cinnamon on it can still give us that sweet ending that we want. If we are often having a bagel and jam for breakfast, maybe we think of some other options that we might want to try. So something like an oatmeal with berries or a Greek yogurt with granola could be other breakfast options to try. So small swaps that we can try to help us better follow the Mediterranean diet. Okay, next slide. All right, so how can we make these changes, or how can we make changes? So what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, what do we need to do to make these changes? Or what do we need to do to make a change? So in order to do that, we have to, again, ask ourselves, where are we right now? And where do we want to go next? Right? So where are we? Maybe it's in terms of the diet, maybe it's more the activity piece, or even the distracted eating piece. Where are we at, and what do we want our next steps to be? Where do we want to go from here? So, and we also have to ask ourselves, what do we need to get started? Maybe we need resources, maybe we need to find some recipes, or maybe we need a shopping list. Maybe what do I need to get started? Am I going to focus more on my meals, or am I going to focus more on my snacks? Right? Maybe one of our goals, or one way to get started, is to move more and sit less. Right? So these are all going to be very individualized to you, depending on where you're at right now. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this presentation was taken from Old Ways, and this is their website. If you are interested in taking a look, they have lots of recipe options. They have menu planners. You can sign up for their newsletter. They have the latest scientific research on the Mediterranean diet, and they just have a lot of great resources. So have a look at their website, which will give you a lot more information on the Mediterranean diet. So if we go to the next slide, that's just going to tell us a little bit more about Old Ways. It's a nonprofit food and nutrition education organization, and their mission is to help guide people to good health. So again, if we kind of pop it back to the previous slide, just so that you can have their website up on the screen there if you want to write that down. But that is the end of my presentation. So we'll open it up to questions now. So I don't think there are any questions written throughout, but if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand, or you can type it into the box. And if you raise your hand, we'll get Cheryl to unmute you, so you can ask your question. No questions from anyone? All right.
No, it looks like you did a good job, Sarah. Nobody has
no questions.
So just another reminder for everybody that as Sarah was saying at the beginning, it's a self-referral program. So info@nfht.ca, or you can call us at our administrative office at 289-252-2139. And it's another way to reach Sarah if you did have some more questions.